welcome to the Stimson Center's webinar, Strategic Security Environment in Western Pacific Waters. We are going to hold for just 1 minute or so that everyone can who have signed up to join us can join us. So if you can give me 1 minute or so, I will get started very, very shortly. Okay, I think I'm sure more people are joining, but we're going to go and get started because our time this morning is limited and we have a lot to talk about. Good morning to everyone again, and as you're signing on, welcome to Stimson's webinar on the security environment in Western Pacific waters. I am delighted to host this what will likely to be a very, very stimulating discussion. This morning and also good evening to you all if you are joining us from Asia. This morning we have a very awesome mix of scholars, practitioners, and a practitioner turned into scholars. So let me introduce each panelist in order that they will speak. We have Professor Susumu Takai joining us from Tokyo. Good evening, Takai Sensei. We're very glad to have you this morning. And following him would be a Miss Emma Shanlett Avery, good friend of mine. We go way back when we were many, many moons ago. She's a specialist on national security and trade affairs on Asian Department at Congressional Research Service. Emma, welcome.
Thanks, Yuki. Thanks for having me.
And then followed by her will be Professor Yurika Ishii, who's a professor of international law at the National Defense Academy of Japan. She's also joining us from Japan this morning. Welcome, Ishii-sensei.
Good morning and good evening. Thank you for having me.
And last but not least, we have Professor Kate Walsh, again, old colleague of mine back when she used to be my colleague at Simpson, but now she has a bigger and greater job teaching at the National Naval War College up in Rhode Island. So Kate, welcome.
Good morning and good evening. Thank you for having me.
So a couple of ground rules of, let me go through some of the administrative rules that we're going to follow. This seminar is simultaneously interpreted. So if you can go down to the bottom of your screen, you will see at the far right corner, you will see a icon that says interpretation language or interpretation that has like icon of like a mini globe. If you click that, you can choose either English channel or Japanese channel, or if you're one of those lucky ones who understand both languages and don't need interpretation, you can keep that off and you can listen to both all the speaker in their language that they're actually speaking. And I will start off the session by posing a question to each panelist to open up the session, and each panelist will go about 5 minutes or so and making their initial comments. And from that point, I will immediately open it up to the questions to the audience for those of you who are joining us this morning or this evening. So in order for me to for you to ask a panelist a question, second from the left icon is you see a Q&A. Please use this box to type in your questions. Many people often use the chat box, but I will not be able to see the chat box while I'm in this session. I would only recognize the question that comes in on this Q&A box. So please do be aware please be mindful to use this Q&A box when you want to ask a panelist a question. So without further ado, let's get started. So a lot has been going on in both South China Sea and East China Sea for the last 10 years or so. And I would start from you, Takai Sensei, that what are the things that worry you most about security environment in the Western Pacific waters?
私の、ゆきさんありがとうございます。一番私が心配しているのは東シナ海における中国の海洋進出で、それでとりわけ尖閣諸島が今奪われそうになっているということについて最大の関心を持っています。で、よろしいですか？続けて。はい。で、中国は2021年の1月に中国海警法を策定しました。で、海警局の船舶に武器使用を認めたんです。で、共産党が信奉する国家戦略家の孫氏は、敵を知り、己を知れば百戦しても勝利するが、戦わずして勝利するのが最上の策であると教えています。中国は日本に対して法律戦と心理戦を仕掛けてきました。東シナ海の安全保障環境はますます緊張が高まっているところです。で、習近平は2012年に国家主席になったときに、偉大な中華民族の復興という国家目標を掲げました。海洋進出を通して半島の拡大を図ってきています。で、2009年にはチベット、新疆ウイグル、台湾、南シナ海を革新的利益と公言しました。そして2012年には尖閣諸島を革新的利益に追加しました。すでにチベットや新疆ウイグルでは統治権をもう確保して、中華民族にするために人権を抑圧して、徹底した教育を強制しています。南シナ海では多くの島嶼を武力で奪い、軍事目的の人口等を造成しました。中国の海洋進出の次のターゲットは台湾と尖閣諸島なんです。で、中国は尖閣諸島を軍事力で奪取しようとすると、アメリカが日米安保条約の第5条を適用して軍事力で支援することを知っていますので、軍艦ではなく政府公船を活用することを考えています。で、海警法によりますと、海警局の船舶は、その中国の承認なしに当初に設置された構築物を強制撤去できること、それから中国の管轄水域内では中国法に違反した船舶を強制駆除できること、そして中国の国家主権に関わる不法侵入や不法侵害があった場合には、武器の使用を含む一切の必要な措置を取ることができるというふうに規定しています。で、この法律の下で中国の海警局は、その尖閣諸島周辺海域でこれまで以上に大胆な行動に出ることが予想されます。なぜなら、2021年、今年ですが、中国共産党の100周年記念の年です。で、2022年、来年ですが、習近平政権の2期目の最終年に当たります。それで、長期独裁政権を狙っている習近平は、2022年までに人民解放軍の完全な掌握と人民の求心力を固めて、独裁の正当性をアピールしようとしていると思われるからです。で、1万トンクラスの海警船に海上保安庁の巡視船が対処するのはとても厳しいです。巡視船は海上保安庁法で武器の使用が厳しく制限されています。外国の軍艦や政府公船に対しては武器の使用ができないことになっています。で、日本の法律では、巡視船が海洋の秩序を維持できないときは、海上警備行動を要請することができます。で、巡視船に代わって海上自衛隊の船舶が領海の秩序維持を行います。海上自衛隊の艦船が出動すれば、人民解放軍海軍の艦艇が出動してきて、武力衝突の可能性が出てきます。で、米中の対立っていうのは、今、新冷戦と呼ばれるほど高まっています。トランプ政権は、中国の海洋進出に危険性を察知したので、南シナ海で海軍が航行の自由作戦を行って、国際法に従うように中国に要請して、それが今も続いています。バイデン政権は同盟国と一緒になって中国と厳しく立ち向かうと宣言していましたが、サキ大統領報道官は戦略的忍耐で対処するとも発言しています。で、バイデン 大統領は、日本が海上警備行動を発令する前に、戦略的忍耐で尖閣諸島の領有を諦めてほしいと日本に強く要請する可能性があります。バイデン政権の対中政策はまだよく分かりませんが、日本がバイデン政権に説得されるのではないかと心配する日本人がたくさんいます。なぜなら、米国が海軍隊の出動命令を従わないということが分かれば、人民解放軍は安心して台湾や尖閣諸島、それから南西諸島を武力で奪取することができると思うからです。で、もし私が日本の首相だったら、次のように考えています。法律を改正して巡視船に武器の使用を認めても、海警船が巡視船に対して体当たりする、あるいは砲撃してきた場合、巡視船は破壊されて海上保安要員の命が危険にさらされるので、法律の改正はしません。で、次に私は中国の法律船と心理戦に負けないよう日本の国民を説得して、で、海上警備行動を発令するまでの間に、バイデン政権に人民解放軍の艦艇が出てきたら、共同防衛して対処するように要請します。そして、警備行動を発令するときに、日本は尖閣諸島を決して諦めないこと、それから中国の軍事行動は控えてほしいこと、自衛隊は決して武器の先制使用はしないこと、国連憲章第2条4項の領土保全のための行動であることを国際社会に発信します。そして日本の行動に対する理解を強く求めたいと思っております。で、それでも人民解放軍が武力攻撃をしてきたら、自衛隊に防衛出動を加令します。そしてその場合、米軍が来援しなければ自衛隊は壊滅的な損害を受けるということも覚悟します。しかし、もし米軍が来援すれば、人民解放軍の艦船は撤退するだろうというふうに期待しております。ということでございます。ありがとうございます。以上です。
Thank you, Takai Sensei. It was very, I guess, sobering view and concern that you just shared with us. So let me turn to you, Emma. That first of all, what is your reaction, immediate personal reaction to what Takai Sensei just mentioned, especially the concern that there seemed to be in Japan, and I wonder if there are similar concerns among our other allies and partners in a broader Indo-Pacific region about this implication of the word strategic patience that was used by White House Press Secretary a while ago when she was asked about U.S. approach to China. And what is your sense that how much of that sense of urgency or sense of concern is being shared within the U.S. Congress or the folks that you work with day in, day out? And lastly, what is your personal view that Biden administration can do, especially given a concern that's raised by Takai Sensei, to reassure allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region about U.S. commitment to stand with the allies and partners who try to defend their sovereignty?
Thanks, Yuki, for those questions. I'll try to unpack them in a short period of time. First of all, I do have to say that these views are my own. I don't represent the views of the Congressional Research Service or certainly any of the members of Congress. So keep that in mind. I'm asked a lot about Congress's view on a particular area, and obviously it's not monolithic. There's 535 members of Congress. They all take different approaches to this national security challenge. But I think that it is indicative if you look at the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2021, which was actually over the President Trump's veto was overridden, his first and only of his term. And probably most important in that is the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, or PDI, which is essentially a framework a region-wide framework for countering China's influence in the region. It's funded at $2.2 billion over the first year, but with an anticipation that those sums will go up. In the Senate Armed Services Committee summary of the bill, they pointed to specific provisions that were designed to deter China's malign behavior in the area. So that's fairly straightforward. Many observers who looked at the bill and the components of it did feel that this sort of commits real resources to standing up to China's influence in the region. And I would say that, well, as I mentioned, there are many different views of how members of Congress view China. There is a bipartisan consensus in terms of concerns about China's role in the region, sometimes for different reasons, of course, and with different amounts of resources committed. But I would say that that has grown, at least during my time serving at CRS. Congress would also like to have some input and be updated by the executive branch on how they are using these resources. So there are some reporting requirements as part of this bill, both from the Secretary of Defense as well as from the Indo-Pacific Commander in terms of how they are using these resources and designing their strategy towards China. The other thing, and this speaks to your question about reassurance of allies, the other thing that specific bill does is puts a floor for the number of troops both in Germany as well as in South Korea. And that was out of some concern that there would be a reduction of US military troops in those areas. So this bill is basically presented, is at the very end of the Trump administration as a blueprint. And there's obviously, it's how it's used depends on the Biden administration's strategy as they build that out and introduce what they feel are the best ways to use this. There's also, I think that there's an expectation that he will include elements of this in the the fiscal year 2022 budget request as well. Beyond that, beyond this specific bill, reassurance would probably include a swift conclusion of the host nation support or special measures agreement, as is known, burden sharing negotiations, cost sharing negotiations with both South Korea and Japan, which are upon us right now and can hang over an alliance when you haven't worked out those specific agreements. And that probably would go a little ways towards, encouraging our allies to participate in some of these maritime operations, whether it be through the Quad framework or through a Quad Plus kind of arrangement, doing things like the Malabar exercises with our allies as well as partners in the region. I'll stop there and let the other panelists speak to some of these other issues. Thanks, Yuki.
Thanks, Emma. So in the Takai Sensei's initial remark, he made a reference to a new Coast Guard law that was passed in the China over the last couple of weeks. So Ishii Sensei, you looked at these laws very closely, and then I think there are concerns raised even by the American scholars like James Kraska about what this law could entail. So if you can unpack that for us, because it just happened so recently, and then I think of course it's been widely reported in the Asian media, but it's not necessarily it may not be that widely known in the our side of the Pacific yet. So Ishii Sensei, if you can unpack that, especially given that with the reference that Emma made about the Pacific Deterrence initiatives and other legislative action that also has been happening here.
Thank you so much. I actually prepared a slide for that, so let me share that with you. And you mentioned the name of Professor James Kraska, but I just want to mention that Professor Raul Pedroso of Naval War College just published an article about this law. So if you have any interest from the perspective of international law, I highly encourage you to access to International Legal Studies, which is the journal that Naval College publishes. So with that, let's respond to Yuki-san's question. I see there are primarily three issues regarding this law from the perspective of international law. The first issue is that the law claims more than what China can claim under the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. China is a party of the UNCLOS. And as a result, the freedom of the seas of the other member states may be jeopardized if China enforces this act to full extent. The second issue is that the law may justify the Chinese Coast Guard to exercise its force beyond what is permissible under international law. Lastly, the law obliges the Chinese Coast Guard to protect its maritime boundary and monitor the activities at the high seas and foreign EEZ. So these are the concerns that I have. And for the time constraint, let me focus on the first 2 points. Sorry. Okay, so here's the concept that the whole CMP Act relies on, which is jurisdictional maritime area. This is a concept that does not exist under UNCLOS. At the draft stage, the draft was published in November. It defined the jurisdictional maritime area as Chinese internal sea, territorial sea, contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, continental shelf, and other maritime areas over which China has jurisdiction. And the other maritime area over which China has jurisdiction would have included areas surrounded by 9-dash line. And as you may know, the arbitral tribunal established under UNCLOS, Annex 7, rejected this line's legal significance in 2017. But China never officially conceded its claim. Now, the final version adopted on January 22nd removed the entire definition of jurisdictional maritime area. But I do not think that the deletion does not solve the problem, because first, the whole law is based on this concept. And also, the Chinese Supreme Court has issued an interpretation note of this term in 2016, which is mostly the same as the draft act. So I assume that Chinese Coast Guard will rely either on this interpretation note or draft definition in implementing this act. Now, for those who are not familiar with Law of the Sea, this convention, UNCLOS, divides the maritime area into water columns and provide the coastal states and user states rights and obligations. And the most important distinction lies here between the territorial sea and the maritime area beyond territorial sea, because this line constitutes the outer limit of the state's territory, where the states can claim its sovereignty. Now, as I mentioned, the notion of jurisdictional maritime area denies this zonal approach, and it treats all the zones in the same manner. So as a result, several provisions would conflict this UNCLOS. The other concern that I have is that this law does not have a provision regarding the undelimited area. And China has not delimited the maritime area except the Tonkin Gulf with Vietnam, which is the only, the partial part of, the undelimited area that China has. And as I mentioned, the CMP, or the Chinese Coast Guard, is obliged to protect the maritime boundary. So if it tries to protect China's claim to maximum extent, for instance, in the case of East China Sea, it means the Okinawa Trough, the Chinese Coast Guard vessel will inevitably confront with other states' coast guards. The second issue is that the law might, allow Chinese Coast Guard to excessively use its authority to use the weapons or use the force. Of course, states are entitled to use forces and weapons at sea as long as it is compatible with international law rules. And it is fine to use weapons when it enforces its law. But as a matter of general international law, there are certain standards. And in the words of International Tribunal for Law of the Sea, Sea's judgment, the use of force must be avoided as far as possible. And where force is unavoidable, it must not go beyond what is reasonable and necessary in the circumstances. And consideration of humanity must apply in the law of the sea. And I see that several provisions under this new act, which might conflict with this provision. Also, China has to comply with United Nations Charter Article 2.4, which prohibits the use of force. And well, there are a number of issues concerning the interpretation of this clause, but taking coercive measures against foreign sovereign vessels like Japanese Coast Guard vessels may violate this norm. And this norm is the one that states cannot derogate from, and that is my utmost concern. So I will stop here, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishii-sensei. So like you and a couple of other international law specialists mentioned, this could raise quite some issues. And it just, Ishii-sensei's slide focused on the East China Sea, but then as we know, South China Sea's claims are even more expensive. So Kate, listening to all this and all the previous three speakers, you had previously supported the concept of something, I guess, to be described as a maritime peacekeeping force. And if you can actually extrapolate on that a little bit and see if how something like that, which is essentially a coalition action and collective action, could help, I guess, easing the tension, if you will, and lower the risk of kinetic contact that both Takai Sensei and Ishii Sensei and also Emma has mentioned that that's the biggest concern.
Sure, and thank you for having me. This idea was proposed in our conversation earlier, and as you heard from the previous speakers, given the growing risks and the recognition of the growing problem and the need, at least I put forward for more innovative ideas on how to address these challenges. And so I was suggesting we do that, and I proposed this idea that was something that I came up with a colleague a couple of years ago, and it seemed to gain some interest. So I was asked to sort of expand upon it. And this is the concept, as Yuki said, about maritime or sea-based peacekeeping. The idea is basically how to address the rising risk of international conflict at sea from escalating into accidental war or deliberate war, while avoiding, adding a deterrent to countries who are adopting gray zone tactics and strategies and taking what are otherwise seen as aggressive actions at sea and to achieve their own maritime ends by force. And so the idea would be to develop an international mechanism for maritime and sea-based peacekeeping operations, very similar to land-based peacekeeping, were termed blue helmets. Our idea was blue hulls, right? Ships painted blue that would serve a similar role. And we contend that the time is right, even though our initial draft was back in 2016, that the problem has only festered further, that there is, in the meantime, growing global attention to the risk posed at sea, conflicts at sea, in the East and South China Sea especially, but also the Persian Gulf, the Arctic, and elsewhere. And also a willingness, a growing willingness to engage collectively, that none of us can do it alone. And I would say even the United States can't necessarily do it alone. And that to maintain freedom of navigation principles, global security, and global maritime commerce, some sort of collective action is necessary. Also, a growing challenge of deterring these gray zone activities. And as I said, the need for innovative approaches for deterrence or prevention, growing interest by the international community in ocean governance. So we just started the new UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, for instance, which will go to 2030. Efforts to adopt new rules governing challenges such as in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, IUU, or illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, undersea domain capabilities, which are commercial and military applications, and also previous ideas such as put forward by our own chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of a 1,000-ship Navy or global maritime network. So I think we're headed in this direction naturally, and it's not actually even a new idea of maritime or sea-based peacekeeping. We have maritime components of land-based peacekeeping operations in, for instance, Cambodia and Timor-Leste, and also peacemaking operations. The Korean War and Persian Gulf War had maritime components. And finally, not only the recognized need and the precedent, but also a new opportunity, which I think the Biden administration presents as they're open to new blue ideas in a broad sense. So finally, I can't go into a lot of details in the interest of time, but I suggest that there are at least four different approaches to maritime or sea-based peacekeeping. The one we were proposing was through the United Nations Security Council, which again is already set up for training and other aspects of doing this. So it would be expanding a current capability. The two big concerns there, of course, are one, China's veto on the Security Council, and also, as one of our speakers in the earlier session pointed out, risk perhaps of China joining. I think those are both, we could deal with both of those, but I'll leave that for the Q&A. Another approach, as Yuki suggested, was multilateral coalition of the willing. Again, we've already started to see this happening in the counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, the CTF-151, in counter-proliferation activities surrounding North Korea and the Proliferation Security Initiative, and also, again, this sort of a 1,000-ship Navy idea that if we collectively at sea are upholding the UNCLOS and maritime law. A third approach could be the United States ratifying the UNCLOS and negotiating an addendum to the agreement that would put forward new rules and processes for sea-based peacekeeping. And finally, another approach, and some of these could be done together, is to pursue an entirely new agreement for crisis management, perhaps, that would establish rules for neutral parties using some of the same principles and training and practices of the UN land-based peacekeeping and apply them to the sea. Again, so this is not entirely new. In fact, there was a book written on this in the 90s, some other pieces in the 2000s, so it's not completely original, but I contend that the time is right for a new approach that has no one country facing off an aggressive and in some cases clearly malign actor. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Clearly, this has stimulated a lot of questions. I already have about the 10 question lining up for you. So I'm going to try to knock off from some of the what seems to be the short, easier or more clear-cut answer one. So this is for any panelist, but I think it might be primarily for Kate. There is a question from Glenn Ford. Is it time for Washington to ratify the Law of the Sea Convention? And I guess that I might have you share that question with Emma, because obviously any kind of these treaty and convention needs to be ratified in the Senate. So first, I think I'll go to Kate on your slot and then go to Emma.
Sure. Well, before I answer the question very directly, let me provide the disclaimer that these views are my own. They do not represent the U.S. Navy, U.S. government in any way. And also, I should say that the paper on sea-based peacekeeping was developed with a colleague of mine, a retired U.S. Navy officer, Rick Norton, to give full credit. But personal view, yes, the United States should ratify UNCLOS. There's no good reason that I've been able to determine why we don't at this point. And I think it actually increases the risks and problems and challenges that we have by being outside of it. It provides China the inside access and influence that we don't have, even though we abide by the processes and we believe in them and we help draft them. So I think it's, you know, in terms of pros and cons, it would be better for us to be part of it, inside of it, and amending it or adjusting it as needed.
Thank you. Emma?
I don't have very much more to add and defer to Kate on most of these issues, but as you might recall, the Obama administration made an effort at ratifying UNCLOS during the lame duck session in 2010, I believe, and there were some very prominent supporters, Senator John McCain, who was on the Senate Armed Services Committee at the time. So there seemed to be a chance then, but obviously that didn't happen. I don't know of efforts right now. I mean, it's early on in this Congress, and there's obviously a lot of other issues on the table right now. There are impeachment hearings, there's COVID relief, but I would not be surprised if some of the members of the Biden administration who also served during Obama's time were interested in that effort. But I have nothing beyond that. I have no special insight or intel on that right now.
Thanks, Emma. I think our next question is, I think relating to this gray zone situation. So question comes from Matt Herman. Good morning, Matt. Any panelist, but I'm thinking maybe I would again start off with Kate and then I maybe get Takai-sensei's view on it as well. His question is about the Coast Guard, the role that actually Coast Guard can play. So he points out that it is IUU fishing, which Kate mentioned, is a serious concern. And in fact, U.S. Coast Guard has quietly built capability out of Guam to address some of these concerns. So is there a value in continued increase of a U.S. Coast Guard presence from Guam, maybe even a detachment in Japan or elsewhere in the region to counter gray zone tactics with gray zone tactics and more directly addressed IUU and other non-traditional threats and kind of try to prevent the kinetic situation from happening. So Kate, your thought, and then perhaps Takai-sensei for his take if he has anything to add.
Well, thank you. My first thought is that the U.S. Coast Guard and other Coast Guard activities, I think, are helpful. But at the same time, there is still a risk that it could be misconstrued as something other than what it is. So if our intent, you know, we have the security dilemma here. So if our intent is to do good and protect and preserve, and yet it looks like it's something else from the other side, what may be defense on our side could look offensive on the other side. You know, that's a challenge. And I think the idea of having blue hulls alleviates some of that concern, takes out some of the escalatory dynamics that even Coast Guard ships might present. And so I think no country can do it necessarily alone. And so while I commend these activities, I think that they may be necessary but insufficient at this point. Of course, there's a shortage of ships, both Coast Guard, Navy around the world. So this is a practical concern, but and I think that's one of the reasons why Coast Guards, given their mission set and also there are more Coast Guard capabilities in this region than sometimes naval capabilities. So I think it's helpful, but insufficient to really address the full scope of the gray zone challenge, which is very much trying to keep things under the threshold of warfare and yet still using aggressive tactics and operations at sea. And I think that the challenge is growing, and so therefore the response must as well.
Thank you. Takai-sensei, if you would like to add something to that, please do. And actually, I do have a related question on this, that do you think Japan's new IUU law, the Domestic Trade of Specific Marine Animals and Plants Act, will affect Chinese maritime activities in Japanese EEZ? Maybe that's for you, and then maybe Ishii sensei's question. So I will start with Takai sensei first.
はい。IU の条約が効力あるかどうかについてはちょっと勉強してないので分かりませんが、日本は海洋政策、基本政策がありまして、やはりそういうような海洋汚染の問題とかですね、海洋環境の保全の問題、十分に注意を払って行動しようとしています。ただ、中国の海警船の船があまりにもたくさん来て、毎日のように尖閣の周りに来ているので、海上保安庁の巡視船はそれに対応するだけで手一杯で、もう船が足りない、人が足りないような状態なんですね。ですから今は、巡視船は尖閣の周りに集まっている、対処しようとしているわけです。で、海警船が出てきて、海上自衛隊が出てってもですね、その間、そのスタンドオフしてても、別にアメリカは来なくても大丈夫なんですね。ただ、海軍が出てきたときは、日本はとても軍隊ではないので、対応できないということなんですね。それからもう一点、先ほどブルーハルの話が出ましたけども、厄介なのは、尖閣は中国も自分の国の領土だと言っている。でもちろん日本の領土であると日本は言ってますね。そういうような領土紛争は領土の問題がある中で、果たして多くの国がそういうブルーハルのような行動に参加してくれるかどうか。これもしそうであれば大変嬉しいんですけどもですね。それは可能性がちょっと難しいかと思います。以上です。
Ishii sensei, do you have anything to add on this specific question about the Japanese new IUU law?
Thank you. I just say that this new law is really to prevent the IUU fisheries, and the focus is to manage the domestic, transaction of fishery, the fish or the aqua products. So the law itself may not, prevent this confrontation between Japan and China, but of course, it will have some impact against illegally fishing Chinese and foreign vessels. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a question from Ambassador David Scheer to any of the panelists. Can someone say that what specific action the Indo-Pacific Command is likely to take under the PDI? I think that might be the question to start Emma off with, and then maybe Kate, if you have something to add. Of course, these are, fully understand these are both your personal views. But go ahead, take it away, Emma.
I think that's a question for the new team at the Pentagon, as well as at the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. And obviously, I mean, Congress can pass these laws and fund these things, but without giving, specific direction and exactly how they would use these resources. But I would defer to those that are more familiar with, specific military operations, deterrence efforts, whether that's new attack subs or other ways to build out the PDI. And I think, as I said, this was, passed at the very end of the Trump administration. And so I think it's presented as essentially just a blueprint for the new administration to figure out how it wants to use it best. I think other panelists may have more specific views and be able to voice them. Thanks.
Kate, as you answer the question, if you can kind of try to respond to this element too. So given that China does not recognize maritime and territorial dispute claims, basically they're all their territories, how can it be expected to adhere to the UN Charter Article 2-4? And I think the core of the question is all these FONOPs that we've been seeing have not really led to scaling back the PLA Navy and Chinese Coast Guard activities in South China Sea. So are there any thoughts on how to impose costs on these Chinese action? And I think you can probably extrapolate a little bit from your initial remarks.
Sure, and I think this is actually the challenge, right? That what we've been doing has not been sufficient to change China's activities. And also at the same time, though, as we've been trying to do this, other countries have seen the global repercussions, right? So what happens in the East China Sea and what happens in the South China Sea does affect other parts of the globe because in part of China's global capabilities and in my view, ambitions. So precedents set in the East and South China Sea is that going to apply to the Arctic? Is that going to apply to the Atlantic and to the Mediterranean Sea and elsewhere? So other countries have realized that what is happening in the Indo-Pacific has global repercussions and would create precedent of might makes right and these types of claims. And so I think that it again leads you to not having this be a US-China confrontation, because that's, I don't think, in the United States interest. And it's also not in the interest of these third parties or these other countries who are facing China, smaller countries facing China's very large Navy and Coast Guard capabilities. And so the proliferation deterrence initiative, that my sense of that is that it's more about defense than prevention, right? It's deterrence, but it's mostly how do we defend ourselves against what is clearly becoming a more aggressive, assertive China. The problem ultimately in South China Sea is China's treating its 9-dash line as a territorial line. This is a problem, and again, sets precedents for the rest of the globe. And so this is becoming more and more a global concern, and therefore global response is required to deal with China's capabilities, and basically saying this shall not stand. It is not appropriate. And so we want to keep this under the threshold of conflict, of course, but I think current deterrence efforts have not shaped China's responses as yet.
Thanks. I think Ishii Sensei had the maybe a two finger
Right.
to add.
Yes, let me just quickly respond to the question. First of all, with regard to Senkaku Islands, it is China that claims that there is a territorial dispute, and the Japanese government has not changed its position that there is no territorial dispute regarding the Senkaku Island. That's one thing. The other thing is that Article 2.4 of UN Charter applies elsewhere between states. So it could be applicable at disputed territory and also at sea. So the fact that the states recognize the dispute of the territorial title does not matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishii Sensei. Next one actually goes to, actually there are a couple of Japan-focused questions on this, so let me present them, try to group them in one. So I think Takai Sensei, I think I probably need to seek your clarification on this, that there is a question from Richard Cronin. Good morning, Rich. That did we hear you correctly that when Senkaku Island is pressured, Japan wants United States to defend it together or mobilize after the end with no firm assurances of getting involved. So in case of a crisis involving China, the United States forces should be the first responder. Is that, he's asking your clarification, is that what he heard? Because if that is the case, it will be it will be a tough sell in the U.S. Congress for something like that. And in regards to that, in order to respond to this Chinese pressure, what Japan specifically is doing to also buttress its own defense capability. It is a question from Rachel Odell. Is there expanding port access, rapid repair of the airport runways, those kind of capabilities? Is Japan putting resources into making its own defense capability stronger? And last but not least, I think this will probably be a question to American side as well. What can U.S. and Japan do together to de-escalate the current tension?
わかりました。 答えてよろしいでしょうか。質問ありがとうございます。私が早口で喋ったのできっと聞き取れなかったかもしれません。で、正しく言いますとですね、海警の船が今出てきてます。毎日のように来ています。それで海上保安庁の巡視船がそれに対応しています。しかし、もし武器を使われたら、海上保安庁の船は鉄板が薄いですから、すぐ穴が開いて沈んでしまいます。で、武器を使わなくても体当たりをしてきたりする可能性もあります。そうすると大きさの点から巡視船は叶いません。そうすると海上の秩序が維持できないということで、海上自衛隊が出ていくことになります。で、中国の海警船と海上自衛隊の船がスタンドオフしているのであれば、アメリカは別に出てくる必要は全くありません。ただ、今度は海上自衛隊が出てきたことを理由に、中国人民解放軍の海軍が出てきたら、戦争になる可能性が出るわけですね。で、日本はもちろん先制的な武力行使はしません。しかし、もし中国が先に撃ってきたら、日本は防衛出動を加齢して対応します。その時にアメリカは支援に来てくれなければ、日本の自衛隊はなくなってしまうだろうということを言いたかったんです。ですから、もちろん当然日本がですね、最初からアメリカが頼るんじゃなくて、日本が単独でやらなきゃいけないことなんです。ただ、武力が日本は小さいですから、もし武力衝突になったら、アメリカの支援が必要だと考えているということです。長くなってすみません。はい。
Thank you, Takai Sensei. Any thoughts on the what U.S. and Japan might be able to do together to reduce the tension or de-escalate the conflict? I think I would start with perhaps Takai Sensei and then open it up to if Kate or Emma do a hand raise, please do.
はい、やはり口だけではなくて、実際、危険ですけども演習するとかですね、中国の人民解放軍が出てきたら、アメリカは必ず日本を助けるということをいつも話すこと、それから行動で示すことです。今、台湾が非常に危険な状態なんです。台湾のマスコミを使って中国はどんどん戦争を仕掛けるぞと脅しています。で、台湾の小さな島の砂利を、海の砂をですね、中国の船がどんどん取ってる。で、台湾は困ってるんですけども、海警の船が出てくるんじゃないかと思って怖くて手が出せない。これがこれからどんどん拡大していくと思います。ですから、やっぱアメリカは台湾に対してももとよりですね、日本に対しても必ずアメリカは支援するということを言ってくだされば、中国はアメリカと戦争する覚悟がないと戦争してこない。となれば、戦争は起こらないと私は思います。以上です。
Thank you, Takai Sensei. I actually do have let's just focus a little bit more on this collective action aspect of it. There's a question from Lawrence Howard from Royal Alberta United Service Institute. How might the Quad or other type of multilateral arrangements be adapted in the handling these situation? So I guess probably, Kate, you went into those multilateral action first, so I would just start you off with it.
Okay, I responded to this in the Q&A, but personally, my view is that the Quad, given how it was conceived, it may not necessarily be the most helpful venue for this, because I think it would be seen as potentially coercive and provocative by China. And so I think it's necessary but not sufficient. And I think for signaling purposes, it could be helpful, certainly, and I think that's where it's at presently. But I think it's a more multilateral coalition with third parties, not any parties to any of these claims or conflicts or even issues, if you will, is necessary. So I think the Quad is too much of a strategic group to make that message clearly. I think a broader coalition is really what I had in mind.
Thanks, Kate. So Takai sensei mentioned about the Taiwan, and there are actually a couple of questions regarding that. One question comes from Kai Chun Wang. What is the strategic role or roles Taiwan might play in this dynamics in the East China Sea or other maritime, challenges in this region? So I think I would start you with Takai
台湾
sensei.
ははい、台湾は中国からの攻撃を非常に恐れています。しかし、毅然として守るつもりでいます。それはアメリカの支援がなければできないことです。で、台湾は中国から攻撃されないように、台湾の独立という言葉を非常に慎重に使っています。で、今、台湾はですね、どんどんこれから中国の今、周辺で演習をやってます、台湾の周りで。ですから、これに対して備えているためにですね、非常に準備しています。ただ日本は残念ながら、台湾で戦争が起こった場合、日本は何もできないんです。それは憲法で禁止されているからです。しかし、アメリカがそこに入ってくれるとですね、台湾と日本の防衛について非常に心強い味方になると思います。ですから、アメリカはですね、そういうことをぜひやっていただきたいというのが、日本と台湾のお願いでございます。以上です。
Does anyone have anything to add to this? And then I think let me push you a little bit more on that, Takai sensei. So how concerned this is a question from Jesse Johnson. How concerned is Japan over the possibility of a conflict and situation, especially with the tension escalating and surrounding in Taiwan? Can the Japanese government and what self-defense forces do to better convey that they would be playing supporting role in such a situation in a support of the U.S. operation, or what can they do when it comes to the Japan's potential role in Taiwan situation?
はい、日本は今言ったように、軍事的なアシストはできない。これは憲法でそう書いてあるんですね。ただ、後方支援の形では協力ができると思います。で、日本は、台湾と日本は一体と考えているんです。つまり、中国が台湾を攻撃するときは、日本に対しても攻撃するときだというふうにみんな理解しております。ですから、台湾に攻撃がないように、アメリカの協力を強く要請しているところです。で、もちろん後方支援ですから、いろんな補給はできるかもしれませんが、戦闘区域の中に入っていかれないわけです。これについてはですね、非常に日本も心配してますので、法律を改正したいんですが、なかなかこれも時間がなくてできないというところで非常に残念に思っております。以上です。
Thank you. I think this will probably have to be the last question. There is a question, very simple one, from Jim Pretstup, who taught at the National Defense University for a long time, good long time mentor of mine too. So so this speaks to the what Takai sensei mentioned about the concerns that many in Japan could have about the Biden administration's approach to China. So since the start of the new administration, Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense have all affirmed Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Treaty, U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, which covers the Senkaku. What more does Japan expect the U.S. to do to strengthen deterrence?
日米安保条約5条を適用する事態は、日本と中国の間で戦闘が始まる時なんですね。しかし、中国の海警船が出動した時には戦争になりません。そうすると、海上自衛隊が出て行って、中国の海警船とスタンドオフしている時は、 アメリカは第5条を適用して出動することできません。ですから、私たちはそこまでアメリカに要求することはしません。ただ、日本に尖閣諸島を諦めて戦争するようなことをしないようにという戦略的な忍耐を日本に要求することはとても寂しいことです。以上です。
And I think on the strategic patience, I think this to clarify, I think this word kind of gained the life of its own, and there are so many interpretations of it. And I think it is actually unfair to characterize this in the way that's been characterized, somehow that this is somehow, Biden administration would ask Japanese strategic patience on Senkaku issues. I don't think this was meant to be used in that context. So I think, let me just clarify that, because it has been interpreted in so many different ways. And this is such an early on in the Biden administration that I think sometimes these words kind of take a life in its own. So let me just clarify that toward the end. But unfortunately, we had reached 9 o'clock hour. I am so sorry. I tried my best, but there's still 10 questions remaining. So sorry for those whose question didn't get answered. But I very much would like to thank all the panelists for this very stimulating discussion. And thank you, everybody who asked the question, for all this very, very challenging question for me to group and try to negotiate. But with that, I would like to thank again everyone. And again, thank you very much for the interpreters for the hard job. And I wish everybody a good rest of the day if you're in the United States, and wish a good rest of the evening if you're